On the 27th of November 1941, Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner sat down at his desk somewhere east of Smolensk and wrote the sentence that more than any other captures what was about to happen to the German army. We are at the end of our resources in both personnel and materiel. We are about to be confronted with the dangers of deep winter. Nobody in Berlin acted on it. 6 weeks later, Army Group Center, the largest German field command of the entire war, the force that had smashed through Poland, France, and 600 miles of Soviet territory, had 140 operational tanks across the entire Eastern Front. In October 1941, Army Group Center alone had started with over 1,400 operational tanks. By March 1942, after replacements had trickled in, the total across the full Eastern Front was still only 140. An army that had terrified an entire continent got to triple-digit tank strength through replacement deliveries, and barely. The cold did not sneak up on anyone. The winter of 1941–42 was the coldest European winter of the 20th century, confirmed later by the American Meteorological Society. Temperatures at the Moscow front dropped to -36 degrees Celsius on the night of December 5th alone. By the worst days of January, some sectors recorded -40 degrees. Germany knew cold winters were possible. They had fought in Norway. They had access to meteorological records going back to the 17th century. They had the clothing. Warehouses in Warsaw held tens of millions of items. Greatcoats, felt boots, gloves, padded winter uniforms. They sat there for weeks while soldiers 1,200 kilometers east froze to death, performing their basic bodily functions. This is the story of how an entire army destroyed itself through one assumption, that the enemy would be defeated before winter arrived, and of how the soldiers paid the price for their commander's certainty. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the document signed 18 months before the first Soviet soldier froze a German in place. On the 18th of December 1940, Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 21. It was the founding document of Operation Barbarossa, and it was built on a single premise: the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks of the first German advance. Not fall back, not retreat to a defensive line and fight, but collapse as a structure, as an army, as a state. Hitler's exact words to his generals: "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The Wehrmacht's senior leadership agreed with him. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch and Chief of Staff Franz Halder were convinced the Red Army could be destroyed in 2 or 3 months. On July 3rd, 1941, 11 days into the invasion, Halder wrote in his diary, "It is thus probably no overstatement to say that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks." He meant it. He was not exaggerating for effect or trying to maintain morale. He genuinely believed it. On October 3rd, 1941, while Army Group Center was still pushing toward Moscow, Hitler announced at the Berlin Sportpalast, "Today I declare, without reservation, that the enemy in the East has been struck down and will never rise again." 6 days after that speech, Reich Press Chief Otto Dietrich announced to assembled foreign correspondents, "For all military purposes, Soviet Russia is done with." Soldiers in the field were reading newspapers carrying those quotes. They were also watching their comrades lose fingers to frostbite. The gap between what Berlin believed and what was happening on the ground in November 1941 was not a matter of delayed information or communication breakdown. It was a choice maintained deliberately against all contrary evidence, because to admit the campaign was not going to plan would have meant reconsidering everything. The original invasion was supposed to start in May 1941. The Balkans campaign, the need to bail out Italy's failed invasion of Greece, and simultaneously crush Yugoslavia after a coup pushed it back to June 22nd. 5 weeks of campaigning weather were gone before the first shot was fired east. Those 5 weeks mattered enormously, not because Germany needed 5 more weeks to win. The plan was never going to work in that time frame regardless, but because every week of delay in summer was a week closer to October mud and November cold. Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner had been warning about logistics before the invasion started. He had calculated that he could reliably supply the army only 500 kilometers beyond the Soviet border and sustain operations for approximately 20 days before a mandatory resupply halt. He put this in writing. Okh acknowledged the calculation and scheduled the campaign around it anyway, assuming Soviet resistance would have collapsed by the time the supply line constraints became lethal. The supply problem that Wagner described was structural, not incidental. The Soviet rail network ran on a broader gauge than European standard. Every kilometer of track captured had to be re-gauged before German supply trains could use it. German truck columns, operating over roads that turned to impassable mud in October rains and froze solid in November, were already hemorrhaging vehicles at catastrophic rates. By the time winter arrived, Germany had lost 35,159 trucks, 24,849 cars, and 2,469 tractors, roughly 62,000 vehicles between June 22nd and December 31st, 1,941. One single fact encapsulates what that means for supply movement. The German army in the east was still using 750,000 horses for logistics. An army that had sold itself to the world as the armored spearhead of modern warfare was moving its supplies by horse-drawn cart across the Soviet steppe. Into that system already at capacity, moving ammunition, fuel, and food, now had to fit winter clothing for 3 million men. The answer was that it did not fit, and the decision was made at the quartermaster level without being explicitly articulated to Hitler that ammunition would take priority over coats. The clothing existed, and that point cannot be stressed enough, because it is the detail that separates this from a story of unforeseeable catastrophe and makes it a story of institutional failure. Germany had manufactured winter clothing. Some estimates put the warehouse stocks at 67 to 76 million items: greatcoats, felt boots, padded winter uniforms, ear protection, heavy gloves enough to equip the field army. Most of it sat at Warsaw railway station for weeks because no locomotives could be diverted from ammunition runs to move it forward. Guderian confronted Hitler directly about this on December 20th, 1941. The exchange is documented in his memoir, Panzer Leader, published in 1952, and is one of the few occasions in the entire war where a field commander directly accused Hitler of lying to his face and was not immediately relieved. Guderian told Hitler, "The greater part of the infantry are still going about in denim uniforms. Boots, vests, gloves, woolen helmets are either non-existent or else are hopelessly worn out." Hitler said the quartermaster general had informed him that winter clothing had been issued. Guderian replied, "I dare say it has been issued, but it has never arrived. At present it is in Warsaw Station, where it has been for the last several weeks, since it cannot be sent on owing to a lack of locomotives and obstructions to the lines. Our requests that it be forwarded in September and October were bluntly refused. Now it is too late." Hitler summoned the quartermaster general on the spot and the quartermaster general confirmed that Guderian was correct. What happened next says everything about the command structure. Hitler flew into a rage, not at the supply system that had failed his soldiers, but at Guderian for his defeatism and for seeing the war at too close a range. He told Guderian directly, "You have been too deeply impressed by the suffering of the soldiers. You feel too much pity for them." That sentence, spoken by the supreme commander of the German armed forces about his own men dying in temperatures below -30°C, is the moral core of this entire story. To understand what the cold actually did to a German soldier in December 1941, you have to go past the statistics to the reality of what it meant to be 22 years old in a denim summer uniform at -36 degrees. General Heinz Guderian had been commanding the 2nd Panzer Army since the invasion began. He was 53 years old, from Kulm in West Prussia, one of the most technically accomplished armored commanders Germany produced. His pre-war book on tank warfare, Achtung Panzer, had laid out the theory that became Blitzkrieg. By November 1941, he was watching that theory dissolve in temperatures his equipment was never designed to survive. He wrote in his diary on December 10th, 1941, "Many men died while performing their natural functions as a result of a congelation of the anus." He was not writing that for effect. He was documenting a medical reality. The cold was so severe and the clothing so inadequate that soldiers were freezing solid in the most exposed moments of human existence. The German standard marching boot, designed for European roads, tight-fitting, with metal studs in the sole, was a frostbite delivery mechanism. The studs conducted heat directly away from the foot into the frozen ground. Soldiers who stood still for more than a few minutes were losing blood circulation to their feet. Those who kept moving were exhausting themselves trying to maintain temperature through motion alone. Soviet soldiers wore Valenki traditional felt boots made from compressed sheep's wool, worn loose, with thick wool wraps inside and galoshes over the outside, loose enough that a soldier could stuff them with straw or newspaper, warm enough that normal outdoor winter activity in -20°C was not a medical crisis. The Germans who encountered Soviet prisoners for the first time that winter sometimes stripped their Valenki off them on the spot. Officers looked the other way. The standard Soviet winter uniform was the Telegrika, a quilted, cotton-wadded jacket that had been refined for Soviet climatic conditions since the early 1930s and further improved after the Winter War against Finland. Paired with matching padded trousers, the Ushanka fur-lined ear-flap hat, and a wool greatcoat, it was purpose-built for exactly these conditions. A Soviet infantryman in full winter kit could operate comfortably in -20°C without generating unusual physiological stress. German planners had seen Soviet soldiers wearing these garments during intelligence assessments before the invasion. The assessment of the Telegrika was that it looked shoddy and peasant-like. That judgment aesthetic rather than practical cost Germany more than any single tactical defeat. Corporal Hans Roth was 24 years old, from Bavaria, serving in the Panzerjäger Battalion of the 299th Infantry Division. He kept a diary throughout the campaign, published decades later under the title Eastern Inferno, a diary kept illegally because diary keeping was forbidden in the Wehrmacht, which is why it survived. On December 28, 1941, during the retreat west of Moscow, he wrote, "Almost running in 3-5 cold in snow almost to the waist, escaping from the enemy that outnumbers you by almost 10 times. Only a healthy person, and even then not everyone, can do this. As for the wounded, light or heavy, they were lost in the snow. Now we know that most of them preferred to put a bullet in their head rather than get captured. The retreat he was describing was not a tactical withdrawal to a prepared defensive line. It was men abandoning their positions because staying meant dying, either from the counterattacking Soviet infantry or from the cold itself, and running west in the dark through waist-deep snow. General Hermann Geier, commanding the 9th Army Corps, put it in one sentence in his official assessment: "Much worse for us than the fire of the enemy and the partisans were the cold, snow, and supply interruptions." A medical officer at a field dressing station, cited in Erich Derschmid's account of the campaign, described his location simply, "Will it never end? Our entire army is made up of cripples." Outside his station, medical orderlies were stacking sawn-off gangrenous limbs like firewood. Martin Puppel, a paratrooper traveling by train toward the front in late December 1941, described the wounded trains coming the other direction. A transport train carrying wounded men stops nearby. Ordinary goods wagons with straw in them for the wounded to lie on, filthy and louse-ridden, with inadequate dressings and hardly any medical orderlies. No heating. That's how the boys are brought home. A railway official explains that there are around 3,000 wounded men passing through here every day. 3,000 men per day through a single railway junction. The weapons were failing alongside the men. The German Army's standard lubricants, a single-grade oil equivalent to modern SAE 15W40, were designed for European operating temperatures. Below -20 Celsius, they stopped behaving like lubricants and started behaving like glue. Below -30, they approached the physical consistency of lard. The Kar-9 8K bolt-action rifle, the standard German infantry weapon, had a bolt that required a smooth, lubricated sliding action to chamber and eject rounds. When the lubricant froze, the bolt seized. Soldiers trying to fire their weapons in contact with Soviet infantry found themselves with an inert metal bar instead of a rifle. The field solution was to strip every trace of oil from the weapon with gasoline and run it completely dry, accepting reduced accuracy and increased wear. Others kept their rifles under their coats against their bodies, using body heat to keep the mechanism operational, and drew them only at the moment of firing. The MG-34 machine gun was worse. Its entire engineering philosophy was based on tight manufacturing tolerances, parts that meshed with precision. In extreme cold, those tolerances became liabilities. The breech block seized. Hot bricks wrapped in rags became standard equipment, placed over the recoil mechanism to maintain enough warmth to allow firing. Units that ran out of bricks or fuel for fires had machine gun positions that were essentially decorative. Artillery pieces lost their recoil fluid to freezing. Recoil springs snapped as the steel became brittle. Crews had to light fires under gun barrels before firing, at enormous risk to themselves and the equipment, simply to restore basic function. Cold-induced barrel explosions increased. The guns that were Germany's greatest tactical advantage over Soviet infantry, superior fire coordination, faster rate of fire, were becoming unreliable precisely when they were needed most. Tanks required fires lit under their oil pans to warm the engine sufficiently to turn over. The PZKW-35 Tet tanks of the 6th Panzer Division had pneumatic gearboxes that froze entirely. The type was withdrawn from service because of it. German synthetic rubber seals Buna material were not cold-rated and failed in extreme temperatures, creating fluid leaks in hydraulic systems. The T-34, by contrast, had been designed knowing it would operate in a Russian winter. Its diesel engine ran on a preheating protocol. crews placed a fuel-soaked tray under the vehicle and lit it, then waited 90 minutes to 2 hours before attempting to start the engine. In temperatures below -35, up to 70% of the fuel mix could be replaced with tractor kerosene to lower the freezing threshold. Wide tracks, 500 millimeters, gave it traction in deep snow, where German Panzer IIIs and IVs bogged down and stopped. Soviet tanks could move, German tanks could not. That asymmetry, playing out across hundreds of kilometers of front, mattered more than any tactical doctrine. There is a number at the center of this story that doesn't appear in most accounts because it arrives later than the most dramatic events, and because it's so stark that people sometimes assume it's wrong. By the 30th of March 1942, the entire German Eastern Front had 140 operational tanks, not Army Group Center, not Army Group South, but the entire Eastern Front, all 3 army groups, every panzer division, every tank brigade. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941 with approximately 3,350 tanks. By December 1941, replacements had trickled in 873 total, across 6 months of the heaviest armored fighting in history to that point, while losses accumulated at a rate that no manufacturing program could match. At the start of Operation Typhoon in October 1941, the final drive on Moscow Army Group Center alone had 1,484 operational tanks. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army started Typhoon with approximately 405 of them. By December 16th, he had 40. The 140 tanks left on March 30th represents the endpoint of that curve. An army that had defined itself by armored warfare, that had built its entire strategic doctrine around mobile shock and rapid exploitation, was conducting defensive operations across a 1,600-kilometer front with fewer tanks than a modern armored brigade. Before getting to December and the counteroffensive, there is a fact about Soviet preparation that upends one of the most durable myths of the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union did not win the winter of 1941-42 because of General Winter. That framing, still repeated, still appearing in popular accounts, misses the point in a way that actually flatters German strategic planning by attributing its failure to weather rather than to Soviet preparation that Germany chose to ignore. The Red Army had formal winter warfare doctrine before the invasion began. People's Commissar for Defense Order No. 109, issued on March 4, 1941, 3.5 months before the German invasion, established detailed operational regulations for cold weather fighting. It covered ski troop deployment, sled-mounted weapon systems, tank preheating protocols, white camouflage requirements, snow fortification construction with breastworks 2 to 3 meters thick, frozen waterway crossing operations, and the specific mobility thresholds at which different units became impaired. 30 centimeters of snow depth impairs infantry and cavalry. 50 centimeters impairs tanks. The Germans produced their equivalent manual, the Taschenbuch für den Winterkrieg, the pocket manual for winter war, in August 1942, a full year into the Eastern Front campaign. After the catastrophe had already occurred, the Soviet advantage was also doctrinal in a deeper sense. The winter war against Finland in 1939-40 had been a humiliation over 200,000 Soviet casualties, 9,614 cases of frostbite in just that 3-month conflict. Tactical failures that led Finland's defenders to believe the Red Army was essentially a hollow force. German intelligence drew the same conclusion and filed it away as confirmation of Soviet military incompetence. What they missed, what their ideological framework prevented them from examining, was what happened after the Winter War. Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko implemented sweeping reforms. Officer ranks were restored and professionalized, purged commanders, including Konstantin Rokossovsky, were rehabilitated and returned to service. Mechanized corps were rebuilt, and cold weather doctrine was codified. The Soviet infantry who attacked Army Group Center's exhausted positions in December 1941 were wearing white camouflage smocks over quilted telegraphic jackets, valenki on their feet, ushanka hats pulled down over their ears. They moved through the snow without the crippling physiological burden that the German soldiers were carrying. They could dig. They could hold a rifle. They could operate as soldiers. The German soldiers opposing them could barely move. On the night of December 4–5, 1941, the front temperature near Moscow dropped to -36 Celsius. The next morning, General Georgy Zhukov, 45 years old, born in Strelkovka village south of Moscow to a peasant family, the son of a cobbler who had taught himself to read from discarded newspapers, launched the Soviet counteroffensive. Zhukov had been arguing to Stalin for weeks that the moment was approaching. His argument was specific. The enemy is exhausted, but if we do not eliminate the dangerous enemy formations now, the Germans will be able to reinforce their troops in the Moscow area with large reserves. Stalin had hesitated. Zhukov pushed. Stalin finally agreed, and on December 5th, the Kalinin Front's 31st Army attacked at 3 a.m. The Western Front joined the following day. By December 6th, the full weight of Soviet counterattack was crashing into the frozen remnants of Army Group Center's offensive formations. The forces committed were not the frozen, depleted, nearly broken formations that had been fighting since June. Soviet intelligence, specifically Richard Sorge's network operating out of Tokyo, had provided the crucial confirmation in September. Japan had decided not to attack the Soviet Union in 1941. That intelligence allowed Stalin to transfer experienced divisions from the Far East divisions trained specifically for cold weather operations, fully equipped, at full strength to the Moscow front. Of the 14 divisions moved west, 4 rifle divisions went directly into the forces defending Moscow: the 32nd, 78th, 93rd, and 238th Rifle Divisions. The larger picture of what saved Moscow was not a handful of Siberian divisions. Between June and December 1941, the Red Army raised 182 rifle divisions, 43 militia divisions, 8 armored divisions, 50 cavalry divisions, 62 armored brigades, and 55 rifle brigades. By early December, Zhukov had a 5/8 division strategic reserve that the Germans had not detected and did not know existed. That is the industrial and demographic scale that German intelligence had failed to model. Germany captured 3 million Soviet prisoners, and the Soviets put 3 million new soldiers in the field. The Soviet Union was not a political structure propped up by terror that would collapse under shock. It was a country of 170 million people defending its own soil, and it could absorb losses at a rate the Wehrmacht's entire strategic planning apparatus had never seriously calculated. Within 2 weeks of the December 5th offensive, the Red Army had pushed Army Group Center back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow's outskirts. Key cities fell: Solnekhnegorsk on December 12th, Klin on December 15th, Kalinin on December 16th. On December 8th, Hitler had signed Directive No. 39, ordering the Wehrmacht to halt offensive operations. On December 18th, The definitive hold order went to Army Group Center. Larger evasive movements cannot be made. Commanding generals, commanders, and officers are to intervene in person to compel the troops to fanatical resistance in their positions without regard to enemy broken through on the flanks or in the rear. What followed was a purge of senior commanders, unlike anything the German military had experienced. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, was dismissed on December 19th. He had suffered a heart attack in November and had been functionally bypassed for weeks. Hitler personally assumed his position, announcing himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army on December 21st. The man who had never commanded anything larger than a regiment in combat now held direct tactical authority over the largest army Germany had ever fielded. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, was replaced by Günther von Kluge on December 18th, the same day as the Standfast Order. Bock's health was the stated reason. Guderian lasted 1 week longer. On December 25th, he was relieved. He had refused to pass on Hitler's Standfast Order and had conducted withdrawals without authorization. A separate, deeply personal confrontation with Kluge. The two men despised each other with enough intensity that they nearly fought a formal duel before Hitler forbade it, culminated in Kluge reporting Guderian's insubordination to OKH. Guderian was sent home. He held no command for 14 months. General Erich Hoepner, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, lasted until January 8, 1942. After requesting permission to withdraw from Kluge, who promised to discuss it with Hitler, Hoepner ordered the withdrawal without waiting. Kluge reported it immediately. Hitler not only dismissed Hoepner, but stripped him of every rank, every decoration, every pension right, and the right to wear his uniform punishments that exceeded existing military law and required special legislation to implement. Hoepner filed a lawsuit against the Reich. He won. His pension was restored by court order, a German court ruling, against Hitler's personal directive, in January 1942, at the height of the war's most desperate moment. On December 20th, 1941, Joseph Goebbels delivered a radio address that announced something extraordinary. The German army needed winter clothing. The explicit admission was shattering. 6 weeks earlier, Hitler had been announcing final victory. Now the Reich's propaganda minister was asking German civilians to donate their coats. His words, "As long as a single object of winter clothing remains in the fatherland, it must go to the front." The collection ran 9 days, December 27th to January 4th, and gathered 67 million items: overcoats, blankets, fur garments, wool underclothes. The German public responded with genuine generosity, and in occupied Poland and Germany itself, Jewish families were ordered under threat of death to surrender all fur clothing before the deadline. The soldiers at the front had their own name for the Eastern Front Medal, issued to veterans of the 1941-42 winter campaign. They called it the Gefrierfleischkorden, the Order of the Frozen Meat. Most of the donated civilian items arrived after the worst of the crisis had passed, defeated by the same logistical constraints that had kept the original warehouse stocks in Warsaw. The railway system that couldn't move military winter clothing in October couldn't move civilian winter clothing in January. The gesture was enormous. The practical effect was modest. The frostbite numbers, when the medical tabulations were eventually compiled, were staggering in their own right. The official Wehrmacht medical count for winter, 1,941-42, came to 112,627 cases. American Army medical studies conducted after the war estimated 200,000 frostbite injuries by the end of winter. German military surgeon Professor Hans Killian's comprehensive study put the total across the entire Eastern Front at over 250,000. What makes these numbers meaningful is the comparison. In the same period, December through February, frostbite hospitalizations exceeded combat wound hospitalizations across Army Group Center. Men were being taken out of the line by cold at a higher rate than by Soviet bullets and shells. Killian's detailed data from the 16th Army sector alone shows what the injuries looked like. 5,243 first-degree frostbite cases, 12,937 second-degree, 1,455 third-degree, with 393 amputations. Of all frostbite casualties across the front, 40% were out of action for 3 months, 10% for 6 months, and 2% were permanently unfit for military service. Feet accounted for 85 to 90% of cases, hands for 5 to 10%, with ears, noses, and genitalia making up the remainder. The tight German leather boot with its heat-conducting metal studs had turned out to be not merely inadequate, it was actively harmful. Men would have been better off in civilian work boots. Sergeant Karl Fuchs of the 7th Panzer Division, 25 years old, from Aschaffenburg, wrote home in his letters, collected and published after the war as his confidence gradually collapsed through the autumn. His letters go from triumphant in July to hollow in November. He was killed in a tank battle near Klin, north of Moscow, on November 21, 1941. He did not live to see the counteroffensive begin. The Soviet journalist Vasily Grossman was 35 years old, born in Berdikiv in Ukraine, the son of a Jewish chemist. He was the war correspondent for Krasnaya Zvezda Red Star, the Soviet military newspaper, and he kept private notebooks through the entire war that he was technically forbidden to keep. His notebooks, published decades after his death under the title A Writer at War, contain the most vivid first-hand account of what the Soviet advance found in January 1942. Following the Red Army west through positions the Germans had abandoned, he wrote, "Germans, frozen to death, lie on the roads of our advance. Their bodies are absolutely intact. We didn't kill them, it was the cold. Practical jokers put the frozen Germans on their feet or on their hands and knees, making intricate, fanciful sculpture groups. Frozen Germans stand with their fists raised or with their fingers spread wide. At night, the fields of snow seem blue under the bright moon, and the dark bodies of the frozen German soldiers stand in the blue snow, placed there by the jokers. That image standing frozen German soldiers, arranged by Soviet soldiers as grim roadside sculpture, is not something a propagandist invented. It is what Grossman saw and wrote down for himself, with no audience in mind. Franz Halder, in his war diary for December 1941, described the situation as the greatest crisis in 2 world wars. Coming from a man who had served on the Western Front in 1914-18, that assessment means something. He had seen the Marne. He had seen Verdun. He believed December 1941 was worse. There is a question worth sitting with about what Germany's intelligence apparatus actually knew and chose not to act on. Fremde Heere, Ost, the military intelligence branch, responsible for assessing Soviet capabilities, was led by Lieutenant Colonel Eberhard Kinzel, and it had failed comprehensively across every dimension that mattered. Before the invasion, German planners estimated Soviet military strength at approximately 3 million men, roughly matching their own invasion force. The actual Soviet military establishment exceeded 5 million. By Christmas 1941, Germany had captured 3 million Soviet prisoners, and the Soviet army they faced in December was an entirely different force, rebuilt from scratch. Halder's own diary captures the moment this became undeniable. His August 11th entry, "The whole situation makes it increasingly plain that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. We reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. These new divisions are not armed and equipped according to our standards, and their tactical leadership is often poor. But they are there, and if we smash a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen." German attaché General Ernst Köstring admitted before the war that it was essentially impossible in Russia to collect any worthwhile information about the Red Army except at the annual October Day parade. The entire intelligence framework for the most ambitious military operation in history was built on parade day observations and ideology. Soviet industrial capacity was equally misread. By 1942, Soviet factories, many of them relocated beyond the Urals during the chaos of the German advance, transported east on flat cars, while German columns were within sight of the railway tracks, were producing over 24,000 tanks per year, 6 times the previous year's output, and more tanks annually than Germany produced across the entire war. The intelligence failure wasn't simply a lack of information. It was a systematic inability to take the Soviet Union seriously as an industrial state and as a military adversary. The racial framework of Nazi ideology and the professional contempt of the Wehrmacht's officer corps for the Red Army were not just moral failures, they were analytical ones. They produced an enemy model that bore no relationship to reality, and the campaign planning built on that model collapsed when it met the actual country. By the end of January 1942, Army Group Center's infantry divisions had been reduced in most cases to between 150 and 200 riflemen per regiment. A fully strength German infantry regiment contained roughly 2,500 men. These formations were at company strength, holding regimental frontages in the coldest winter of the century. Germany's total casualties on the Eastern Front from June 22nd through November 30th, 1,941, before the worst cold. Before the counteroffensive were 743,000, 23% of the 3.2 million men who had crossed the border. Army Group Center alone suffered 262,524 casualties between December 1,941 and February 1,942. Sergeant Lieutenant Heinrich Schmidt-Schmiedebach described the moment the weapons stopped working. At first, it was not so bad, perhaps 15 or 20 degrees under zero, and there was no danger for our weapons. But suddenly, at a certain point, the rifles didn't shoot anymore. This was the turning point in the Winter War. He was describing a physical phenomenon, lubricant freezing at a specific temperature threshold, but what he captured was also a psychological turn. The German soldier had been told his equipment was superior, his training was superior, his army was invincible. When his rifle stopped shooting, something more than the weapon had failed. What the winter of 1941–42 actually settled was simpler and more consequential than any single battle. It settled that the Blitzkrieg model, the idea that a war could be ended in a single, overwhelming stroke before the enemy's capacity for resistance could be organized, had reached the limit of its application. Against Poland and France, it worked. Against the Soviet Union, which had the geography to trade space for time and the industrial base to absorb losses and rebuild, the shock wore off before the state collapsed. What was left was a long war, and Germany, as Guderian had privately written to his wife Marguerite in December 1941, did not yet know how to come out of this. The German army did not collapse in the winter of 1941–42. It held on through a combination of Hitler's standfast order, the flexibility of individual unit commanders who reinterpreted it practically, and the extraordinary physical endurance of soldiers who had nothing left to endure with. The front stabilized by spring. Germany would launch new offensives in 1942. The war would continue for 3.5 more years, but the army that pushed east in June 1941 no longer existed. Its equipment had been ground down. Its veterans, the men with 3 years of combat experience, the ones who knew how to improvise and adapt, had been killed in numbers that could not be replaced with training camp replacements. Its irreplaceable strategic reserve of initiative had been spent in a campaign that never achieved its objective. The 140 tanks Germany had operational across the entire Eastern Front in March 1942 is not just a military statistic. It is a number that closes the chapter on a particular kind of confidence. The confidence that an enemy can be understood through contempt, that a campaign can be planned without accounting for the possibility of being wrong, that warehouses full of winter coats are unnecessary because the war will be over before winter. Erich Hoepner was dismissed on January 8th, 1942, stripped of his rank, his medals, his pension, his right to wear his uniform. He went home to Berlin and filed his lawsuit and won it, and lived quietly for 2.5 years while Germany's fortunes deteriorated on every front. On July 20th, 1944, he was waiting in the Bendler Block, the German army headquarters in Berlin, to be appointed commander of the Home Army as the conspirators moved to assassinate Hitler. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. Within hours, the plot had failed. Hoepner was arrested that same evening. He was tried on August 7th and hanged the following day. He was 57 years old. He had commanded armored forces from Poland, through France, through the Soviet Union, had reached the outskirts of Moscow, had been stripped of everything for ordering an unauthorized withdrawal to save his soldiers' lives. In the end, he was executed not for the retreat, but for trying to end the war. The man who signed his death warrant, as he signed thousands of others, was still in power, still prosecuting a war whose fundamental premise had been exposed as fiction in the snow before Moscow 3 years earlier. That is where the laughter stopped, not in any single moment, not with any single battle, but in the accumulation of -36-degree nights, frozen rifles, gangrenous limbs in stacks outside field hospitals, and Vasily Grossman's frozen German soldiers standing in the blue moonlit snow, arranged by their enemies into poses of defiance they had not chosen and could not have anticipated. The German army learned nothing from the Winter War that might have saved it. The Soviet army learned everything. That asymmetry in doctrine, in equipment, in institutional willingness to confront failure and adapt, decided the winter of 1941–42, before the first German soldier pulled on his summer weight denim uniform in October and looked at the sky.